It's time for another update. Going into this week, I wanted to be ambitious. From the last video, I talked about players being able to select what type of towers they want to bring in and what enemies they want to fight, allowing you to mix and match towers and enemies for some interesting combos. I can't really progress much further without actually figuring out what these mix and match elements are. The first tower archetype I want to create are pirates. I want them to be my introductory towers, each with really simple functionality both to help me build out what tower types I want to make in the future, but also when players get into the game for the first time. And with that, I decided to bust out my mini Wacom tablet and get to drawing with my tragically lacking artistic skills. This wasn't really to create something to help me concept, but let me play around with different styles within what I might be able to actually do when it comes to 3D artwork. After drawing for a bit, the more low poly sculpting style seemed to be my go-to option. It's a decent style while keeping things simple enough that someone without a great art focus can possibly deliver on. I opened up Blender and got to modeling a pirate. I quickly learned that most of what I remember on Blender is sketchy at best, and after watching some videos and tutorials, I did get a pirate at the end, but it took me way longer than I'd want to, and I wasn't super happy about the final result. Knowing I needed to get back into Unreal, I opted for a different answer. For now, just to get things working, I'll just model some of the weapons of the pirates. This is a nice placeholder, and it actually lets me practice Blender again with some more simple elements, and will let me get back to the actual game. First up, the cannon. This one I think turned out a lot nicer and will read well in the game. It even has its own emission layer for the fuse to help give it some extra pop. Let's bring that into the engine and get to work on our first custom tower. This tower will be a standard area of effect tower, launching a cannonball at a target location and blowing up in a big explosion, damaging all enemies it hits. This requires a lot of new things that I've yet to make, so let's get started. For the actual damage area, I created the concept of a deployable. A deployable will be spawned at a location, wait around for a while, and then after that delay will do some action. Keeping this generic means other towers in the future can use this again. When deployed, we bring in a decal, X marks the spot, to show where the deployable is and have it fade in and out in time with the actual deployable doing its action. For its action, we simply check its radius when we do the action for any enemies, and in this case we deal damage. With some construction script logic, we can easily scale its radius of effect, and I can override the fire functionality to do whatever I want to in the future. The cannon though needs to lob a cannonball at the location, but since this is just a visual effect, I made it as a one-off blueprint. Since this cannonball must land 2 seconds after it is fired to match the deployable, I first tried to manually lerp its horizontal and vertical position to kind of create the illusion of an arcing path, but this just looked wrong. It didn't feel real, and it just looked very strange. My second approach was to add the projectile movement component to it and launch the projectile to the deployable's location, but this created a second problem. While we can get the projectile to the location, I have no way of controlling the time it takes to get there with Unreal's built-in projectile logic. It was time to take a physics refresher and look up projectile motion. While this could get very complicated very fast, two things allowed me to keep this simple. All projectile motion is a combination between a horizontal velocity and a vertical velocity. The horizontal velocity is easy. Get the distance from spawn to the deployable and divide that by the time it should take to get there. Easy. The vertical component is quite different, but since I'm assuming the starting and ending height of the arc are the same, I get to ignore a lot of the extra stuff I would need to figure out, and can simply multiply my gravity force by a half of the time it takes to get there. With the vertical and horizontal known, we can apply that velocity into Unreal's projectile movement component and it'll work. I will eventually need to offset the height of the cannonball so it looks better, but future me can worry about that one. I knocked this one out first since it was the one that required the most custom logic and I wanted to see what functionality would be nice for all towers to inherit. Two things popped up. The first is the concept of a fire location. We don't always want to spawn things from the tower's origin. While I didn't use it for the cannonball, I did use it for the particle effect when it fires. The second was actually removing functionality from the tower. When a tower hits, it was popping up a damage number by calling a function on itself. The cannon tower had a problem with this, as it was the deployable damaging, not really the tower itself. To fix this, I moved the tower damage pop-up onto the base enemy itself. Now when I do a damage event, I pass in the tower that dealt the damage, and for a deployable, I added the concept of a deployable's owner to be passed in, and the enemy is responsible for creating the damage pop-up. Finally, we had one more thing to do. Right now, all towers just target enemies randomly, but in any tower defense, it would be helpful to be able to tell the tower what types of things they should target. Closest enemy, furthest enemy, healthiest enemy, weakest enemy, random if you want. These are all useful depending on the type of tower. I created a new enum of aiming types, and now when we go to select a target, we check what type of targeting we are on, and loop through all the nearby enemies, looking for the enemy that best matches the aiming type. And that was a lot for just one new tower being added in. However, the next two towers ended up being mostly Blender time due to how I've set these towers up to be built in the future. Tower 2 is a flintlock. While this will be a buccaneer shooting the flintlock, we are just working on the weapon for now. This will be a longer range single target tower, and after modeling the actual weapon and importing it in, we needed to create a new base class, a projectile. Up until now my towers just instantly did damage, but I would want some towers to shoot items at an enemy and delay the damage until it hits. We gave it the concept of a movement speed, and gave it logic to move towards its target at that speed until it gets to the target, at which point it will deal damage. Since we previously set up concepts like moving the damage pop-up to the enemy, and passing along an owner so we know who did the damage, the hardest part about all of this was just setting up a quick lerp to the target location, and making sure it kept going to that enemy's last known location in case the target dies in transit. This took maybe an eighth of the time to set up as the previous tower. Tower 3 is even simpler, the Swashbuckler, or for now, the Cutlass. This tower is a melee attacker, rapidly attacking and dealing decent damage but requiring melee range. All this tower is copying the base tower and overriding the fire function to do a simple sphere check and hitting everyone in the sphere check, rather than selecting a specific target. Since this was very simple on the logic, I spent some extra time rigging the sword to do a very simple slash animation, just so I could visually see it take its action. These are my only towers for now, and I want to get into a place where I can build them rather than placing them manually in the editor. I created a new widget button that knows which tower it is associated with and adds them to a grid. I added them to a grid. A grid? The way UI works in Unreal is actually really nice, but sometimes some elements just work in a strange way, and there's often duplicates for similar types of functionality. I did finally find the correct version of the type of grid I wanted, and was able to dynamically populate that list. We let the game mode have a concept of equipped towers, which are the towers I'm able to build this specific play session, and it created a new button for each. Now onto enemies. We need something for the pirates to face, and for that we are going to start with dungeon crawlers. Slimes, goblins, mimics, trolls, all great ideas. But for now, just the slime. You have probably seen me fight these things up until now, but I didn't talk too much about them. When I made the pirate, I also looked into making a simple slime enemy and used it as an excuse to try inverted holes, which gave me the colored outline the slimes have. I highly recommend looking up a more detailed explanation of this, where you basically copy a model, flip it inside out, expand it, and then make it so the faces, with their backs to the camera, are actually invisible. If I want to do this going forward, I'll need to iron out the process, as trying to animate this was a nightmare, but it was nice to explore the idea. I made 3 types of slimes, and they all took 15 minutes. Sometimes it's just that simple. The green slime is a standard enemy, normal speed, normal health. The red slime is a speedy slime, traveling at basically double the speed, but with a lower amount of health. And finally we got the chonky slime. This slime moves slower, but has a much higher health pool. All of these are just variations of the base enemy, and have these different behaviors by just adjusting core stats. Super basic, but effective for seeing how these changes impact gameplay. In the future, I might have the large slime explode on death into 2 slimes that spawn on nearby squares, or even jump over maze walls. Keeping it simple for now helps me keep building the foundation, as if I start working on these things too fast, things can quickly turn into spaghetti code. Even this week alone I had to refactor a few things even though the game is as simple as it currently is, so it's best not to stretch myself too thin. I could push further this week, but keeping in the spirit of not spreading myself too thin, I'm taking some time to better polish some existing things. UI buttons now have icons to go with them, I have a little text debugger to show me what building state I'm currently in, and I also made 20 very simple, straightforward ways to fight against, so I could start maybe tweaking some of the balance tuning and see kind of how the game plays in a full play session. These make the games much more playable, and it gets me an actual idea of what I can actually mess around with to make this game fun. I spent quite a lot of time just setting up a Cutlass alley for slimes to run down, and I definitely think we have something going here. Next week, I want to work on the next biggest blocker for creating new tower types, buffs and debuffs. If I want to make a tower that slows an enemy, or a tower that rallies nearby towers to attack faster, I need some generic way of applying and handling these types of buffs and debuffs. If I'm lucky, I'll also be able to tackle upgrades for towers, but we'll see how deep the buff and debuff rabbit hole goes. That system can get very complicated very fast. Anyways, I hope everyone has a great rest of their week, and I'll see you next time.